Brendan Boyle. I'm the president and CEO of Vintri. I am a bit of a self-proclaimed data addict. I love what we can do with it and the potential of everything that it has and holds. And in turn, we've built the company Vintri Technologies, and our main focus is helping businesses make informed decisions. And one of the main features of that and how that's done is through data. Data is key to that, and so today's topic, of course, is around the transition from documents to data, and how the oil and gas industry can go about that, why it's important, and yeah, lots of good discussion around that. So just a little bit of housekeeping and how we'll go through this. We did have a comment section. We now have a chat session, so please feel free to throw questions and comments in the Q&A area there, and Geoffrey and I will be happy to address those towards the end of our time. With that being said, we have a special guest today with us, Geoffrey Cann, who's joined us, an industry expert with an outstanding career and experience in oil and gas. He's an advocate for the digital and the transformation of how the industry and how data can become such a huge part of that transformation. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Geoffrey Cann. Geoffrey, if you could just introduce yourself, and then Geoffrey's got a brief presentation for us. Then we'll get into a little bit more discussion from there.
Thank you, Brendan, for that kind introduction. And as mentioned, this presentation is entitled Oil and Gas in a Post-Pandemic World, 4 Scenarios. I prepared this presentation in response to a request from the board of directors of a Calgary-based technology company who was holding a board offsite and wanted to help the board get ahead of this question around what the impact would be on oil and gas as we begin to see some sign that the pandemic may be coming to an end, either solved through vaccine or because we've simply become used to it and have transformed society as a consequence. If you're interested in this presentation, I encourage you to contact me at my website, geoffreycann.com. There you'll find a panel or a web page where you can reach out to me directly by email to engage with me, or to request that I present this material to your board or management team. And I encourage you to do so. The material is fresh, and the questions that the presentation tries to address are very, very important for industry at this time. Let me leave this start off this presentation by leaving you with just 3 messages. The future of oil and gas post-pandemic is far from certain. First, the macro drivers for the industry are very ugly. By that I mean the scenarios, the facts of facing the industry in terms of supply and demand are not good at all. In this presentation, I'm only going to touch on a few factors, but if you want to see the full presentation, it is 45 minutes of material prepared for your audience. The macro drivers are very ugly. Number 2, oil and gas is really struggling in the face of these factors. And number 3, the future is highly fragmented, and I can foresee 4 fairly different, quite distinct models or worlds that we will find ourselves in dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. To really appreciate the situation that we're in, it's helpful to actually go back about 10 years. For the past decade, the bulk of growth in the global oil and gas market has actually been taken by the United States. You can see this in BP's energy statistics. The little black dots in the bottom of the chart on the left cover the time period of the past decade. The big orange bar here in the middle is OPEC's production. OPEC's production has actually grown during the past decade, but it has not grown tremendously. And in fact, the American growth has been greater in just sheer volume. Added up, American volume growth is actually greater than OPEC and Russia combined. So from a perspective of companies participating in the global market, OPEC in orange, Russia in purple, and the United States here in green at the bottom, the market has indeed grown, but the biggest competitors, that is Russia and OPEC, are losing market share. Now, any company in the competitive industry faced with the prospect of losing share is going to react. And that's precisely what happened over a year ago when Russia and OPEC got together and agreed to try to work together to manage the market. They were mostly successful, but American production continued to ramp ahead. Fast forward now to the pandemic in February of this year, 2020, and Russia and OPEC it could not come to terms with reducing the supply in the market to cope with the shortfall in demand that was being triggered by the pandemic, and they proceeded to flood the market with oil. Now, where did that oil go? Well, for the past decade, oil has only gone into this market in Asia. This is where all the growth is. If you look at the other bars below the chart, they're all pretty flat. So the only place where there's any demand opportunity now is in the Asian markets. However, China, of course, shut down very quickly in the pandemic. And where did all that oil go? Well, it went into inventories. So it's stored in strategic petroleum reserves and tanks all around the planet, waiting to be unlocked and turned back over to the market. Now, what does this mean for oil markets in the future? I like this data from Wood Mackenzie. What it shows is oil basins by their productive capacity, which is shown on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the break-even price required for those basins to be economic. And the little gold diamond in the middle of each of those basins is the average break-even price for the whole basin. And as you can see, the diamonds sometimes are at the bottom of the box or at the top of the box. And what that means is that some wells in that basin are going to be either very low or very high cost. But on average, the break-even price is shown by that little yellow diamond. If we put the current price of oil on our chart, which is here roughly $40 a barrel, and we show where the current market volume is, shown by the vertical bar at 85 to 90 million barrels per day, this says that at all the basins to the left of the vertical are going to be roughly economic. In other words, the break-even price of those basins is in the money. So those basins will be sanctioned. Those to the right of the chart, however, the average cost, average price required for those basins to break even is above the current marginal price of oil. And the consequence is these basins are uneconomic. You might ask, well, where is the American shale basin here? And it's represented by this big gold box to the right. And this explains why we're seeing bankruptcies in the United States as the reality sets in, that these basins need to lower their costs so that they can be economic in a low price oil world. In the full presentation, I go into some depth as to the different factors, but one of the things that is important to kind of walk through is what will trigger oil demand recovery. And it is tied to several contingent factors. Number one is, what is the timeline to get to a vaccine, and how long will we be in this period of flare-ups and outbreaks where we're in this kind of odd game of virus whack-a-mole, so we try and temper and bend the curve. Number two is when, if ever, will we return to business as usual, and what exactly is our new normal? For example, recent polls say that as many as 30 to 35% of Americans will never take a vaccine. This implies that North America will have the virus floating around now for the foreseeable future. What does this mean for business, and how do we configure our businesses so that we can deal with the fact that the virus will be present in what appears to be almost permanently now? What is the growth in automation? During the pandemic, what we've discovered is the rapid success of the automation companies. And I'll use Amazon as a case study. Amazon has done exceptionally well through the pandemic because it's automating and helping deal with replacing retail shopping, in-person retail shopping, with online shopping services. This rapid growth in automation in our society is altering quite dramatically what our world looks like today and for the foreseeable future. And then, of course, what does that mean for the demand for petroleum products? I mentioned that there's been a huge buildup. There was a significant oversupply in industry of oil products because of the OPEC and Russia expanding production precisely when the pandemic kicked off. That oil is all gone into storage, and it's now waiting for markets to return so that it can be consumed. And it'll take months, if not a year or two, for that full inventory to be consumed. Even though in the United States, the demand for distillate has actually gone up, distillate stocks, meaning products like diesel fuel, the reality is the inventory is still running many months ahead of its long 5-year long run average. So there's still a lot of inventory to work through. And then, of course, this question of how do we bend the oil curve? Will the curve for oil start to flatten out because of Paris Climate Accord adjustments? Will OPEC come back in and revitalize their relationship and start to manage the oil curve directly? What will be the pace and impact of decarbonization? There's an ongoing and steady stream of announcements now of countries who are backing the Paris Climate Accord and committing to long-term strategic changes in their carbon footprint. And that has a major effect, obviously, on the petroleum industry. Oil and gas companies have to take robust measures to counter the state of the industry. And the first piece of data that I typically like to see is what's happening with business failures and bankruptcies. Business bankruptcies in oil and gas are running at pace with where we were in 2014, 2015, maybe slightly ahead. So by the end of the year, we may well have a record year of bankruptcies across North America. But for the moment, we are within the range of normal from the last significant downturn. Next major step that oil companies take is what I call portfolio shaping. Since with the demand now uncertain, oil companies now high grade the portfolios of assets. And so only the best assets with the fastest time to production, the lowest operating cost, and the lowest capital investment get sanctioned. And so the portfolios get shaped. Low productivity wells, high cost wells get shut in or abandoned, and only the best prospects are prosecuted for the future. So this reshaping of the portfolio is an ongoing activity. The reshaping of the portfolio, coupled with asset write-downs, creates a playground for merger and acquisition activity. And sure enough, over the last 2 to 3 months, we've started to see a step up in acquisitions, mergers, and this should continue. Because of the financial challenges many oil companies are facing, boards everywhere are looking at their strategic options. Should we stay in business or should we sell? And as a result, we should see an ongoing interest in M&A throughout the industry. Of course, any company that's still active is doing everything possible to reduce costs. And we can see this in job loss data for the industry. Hundreds of thousands of jobs have been taken out and more to come for sure. And last but not least, and a topic important for this webinar, is business overhaul. How do we now transform these businesses to make them more resilient, able to cope with what appears to be a near permanent fixture of a virus circulating in our North American society? And how do we transform our business processes to be able to create an improved level of resilience? So let me just walk through just a few examples of what I mean. We're all now familiar with how much time we're spending in virtual meetings with Zoom, but inside oil and gas, there's an equal interest in adopting things like remote monitoring. As an example, one major Canadian oil company has moved one of its significant control centers out of Fort Mac down to Calgary because it's health-wise safer, and the technology to enable this is in place, and it improves the overall resilience of the business not least of which for the pandemic, but if you reflect back on the major forest fires that took place in Fort McMurray 2 years ago, those created an additional impetus to move some of those jobs and some of that work out of harm's way into safer locations. Safer, no fires, and safer because better healthcare access. Next is other remote control centers. I mentioned remote control centers moving, but the ability to move some of this remote activity into central locations, not just control rooms, but monitoring of all kinds, cameras and sensors, and this infrastructure is now in place and available to be deployed. Industry in oil and gas has now a built-in incentive to reduce the physical number of workers on site. There's always been this incentive, of course. It's lower cost, better safety outcomes because there's a reduction in driving, and a lower carbon footprint because of the lack of lower emissions associated with driving. But under the pandemic, there's a greater incentive now. We now have a healthcare incentive. And so the industry is moving hard to make sure that there are fewer workers in harm's way. This, of course, drives an interest in automation. Most of the technology companies I deal with are reporting that this is proving to be a very, very good year if you're in the automation business, digitization and automation. The demand for this took a slight dip in the March-April timeframe when oil and gas companies, for the most part, slowed everything down so they could assess the world that we are in. But starting in summertime and now continuing on through the fall, there's been no let up in projects that are driving to change because the underlying pressures have not gone away, and they don't look like they're going to be relieved anytime soon. Last one I would like to comment on is that there's been a significant need now to reconfigure certain business processes in oil and gas, which have withstood and have been have worked for years. And a good example of this is field ticketing. Field tickets in a historical, our legacy practice is that those would flow into a central office where they would be reviewed and captured in systems. But now employees are not working in a central office. They're working from home much of the time. So those processes have to get reconfigured. And they can be reconfigured with paper or more efficiently by turning the paper into a digital transaction. And it's this drive to digitize, which is what's really stepped up as the industries are now reconfiguring these processes for our post-pandemic and more resilient world. Now, in the presentation, the full presentation, I go into four big scenarios where we featuring our ongoing movements to globalize or nationalize our various economies, and the shift between traditional fossil fuels and green energy, and how that's creating four worlds for us to contend with. But if you'd like to see that, you'll have to give me a ring to get the full presentation. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brendan, and we'll continue our discussion around the role of data and its importance as we move out of a pandemic world into our post-pandemic world.
We could chat now. No, thank you very much, Geoffrey. That's such a great insight into the industry, and you know, obviously there's challenges, but I think, you know, that's you know, with that, I think it's driving a lot of this change that's coming, and it's driving that push towards, you know, how can we be more efficient? How can we leverage information and data to do this better? So yeah, we wanted to go through and discuss a couple of questions and get, Geoffrey, your take on things and go back and forth a little bit about it. You know, I think what we see a lot, and we hear about it, PHMSA 192 and changes down there in the US. How are regulations evolving to mandate, you know, traceable, accessible records as part of oil and gas operations? And I'll preface that with, you know, our presentation today is about documents to data. A lot of the regulation that's coming is focused on records, which technically can be, of course, your documentation. But I think it's important to talk about how that's evolving, and how, you know, maybe going a step further and using data will set you up that much better for what you're doing, help you be compliant, but also set up this almost differentiator that data can be for you to push you into the next stage of your operations.
Well, the regulations, to your point, the regulations are changing to deal with this matter. If you look at the industry, roll back 20, 30 years, the regulations have evolved dramatically to support this notion of traceability. One of the drivers has been the success and track record of the aviation industry in improving the performance of aircraft. I mean, for those of us old enough, you remember, it seemed like 2 or 3 decades ago, there was an aircraft falling out of the sky every week. That's pretty much disappeared as a news item. And one of the reasons is that the aviation industry, has been so successful at being able to improve its maintenance practices, but also to make sure that things like fake parts and fraudulent equipment and the like does not get into the aircraft. The oil and gas industry cottoned on to this after the BP Macondo disaster in the United States. And at that time, Shell had reached out to a number of technology companies working in the aerospace industry to say, how do we bring some of this aerospace know-how into the oil and gas industry? And so the industry figured out pretty quickly, we can't tolerate too many of these high-profile negative incidents, and that drove the interest in the industry. But at the same time, the other industries are further ahead, and the regulators began to say, hey, tell us about where the history of these parts and products in your infrastructure. Add to that the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster, which raised the specification for rail carriers, and then a whole series of pipelining problems that we've all experienced. 2 profile ones in Canada, 1 in the United States. And this triggered the regulators to say, well, hang on a second, if we can move the performance of these other industries up, why can we not do the same thing in oil and gas? And that's what's triggered the regulations and regulators to say, we can do better in this industry, and let's start to progressively move the regulations up to mandate traceability. Now, there's a Brendan, you probably could better at articulating this than I am. But there's a big difference between tracking something and tracing something.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something that we always like to differentiate, and we talk about. I mean, tracking. We always attribute that to how you're monitoring your package that's coming from Amazon, which is very relevant to everybody these days, I'm sure. And that's an area where the logistical side of the industry, whether it's monitoring where pipe are moving through your supply chain, et cetera, that's something that's tracking. Now, to touch on the traceability, that's really more about the DNA, everything that's gone into whether it's a pipe, valve, flange, or fitting. Do you know that information? Has it been validated across the supply chain? Can you make sure that it didn't change an identity or change in some sort of attachment to its records along the way? That's that concept of traceability that's so important. Being able to kind of, if we sit today and look at our existing infrastructure that we have, can I show where that came from? Basically, what is its birth certificate and how it got into my operation? And the current state of that, and maybe this touches on a bit of our later question, but has typically been to preserve the records and the documents that you may have received from your supply chain. Now, that works, but I think there's this push towards that efficiency, and there's a lot of value, which we'll touch on in our next question, in terms of we can use it as data. We can do more validations. We can be more aware, but we can use it in various parts of things, use it in construction to make better decisions there. And then, of course, I mean, all the analytics and things that come with it, all the while still fulfilling that regulatory requirement that you may have for your record keeping. So lots of potential there. And that kind of segues us into our next question here. What are the tangible benefits what tangible benefits can a switch from documents to data bring an organization? And I can certainly start this up because this is the world that we deal with day to day. We're helping organizations do that at Vintri. That's kind of our main focus. And I touched on it a little bit before, but I'm sure, just kind of taking a step back, the ability to validate information and data that's contained in records versus doing that in a system-wide fashion, leveraging the actual usable data. You can just imagine that it's so much more efficient. So you're able to find any of these issues, any of these concerns that may creep up long term as part of the operations of your infrastructure. That's a huge aspect of things. And so focusing on that ability to actually trust and bring quality to the data that you have about your infrastructure, that's so critical in terms of how the industry is going to evolve. Another aspect that we like to talk about a lot is the accessibility of it. Just quite simply, the concepts of having binders and file boxes, even on site, or in your operations, obviously very time consuming and difficult to manage. Things get lost, a binder gets left somewhere, and now you've lost information and key records that may make up the traceability of that asset. So, you can imagine transitioning that to a way that can be stored in a cloud-based system. It can be accessed at any time, can be accessed offline, it can be sorted, trended, you name it. These are all critical to how the industry can evolve in terms of how they build infrastructure, operate infrastructure, and of course, regulate it. So some really great things that can be done with it there. Geoffrey, I'll pass it over to you for your thoughts.
Well, I mean, one a specific benefit that that I would see if I were back into the how oil and gas companies are behaving today is that the data that you have about the asset that you're buying, the more accessible it is, the more reliable it is, the more you can put it into an appropriate context. It's not just a box of papers, but rather it's linked in a digital fashion or to an electronic fashion to a specific asset. The higher your confidence level is in that asset. You can see this in the companies that are buying and selling used assets in oil and gas. If you can show the provenance of that asset, the warranty, where it came from, who sold it to you, how much did you pay for it, was it ever touched or maintained or repaired, what's been its life cycle. If you can prove that, you can sell that asset at a much higher value than you can if you say, well, I don't have any reliable records about this asset. At that stage, it's just a piece of steel. So one of the more material benefits here, particularly in a transactional world, where back to this, we're shaping our portfolios, we're revaluing our assets. Those that are accompanied with quality information that gives you greater confidence about that asset are going to fetch a much higher price on the marketplace. Absolutely. And that relates directly to value. And today's paper boxes just don't cut it. So that's how one of the key elements here. I certainly flavor the efforts here.
Well, I think you touched on a really great thing there in the sense that, looking at this from your, let's call it capital project expenditure. How, the big driver there, obviously, to save money and time. That's the way projects go. And in that sense, I think that perception has been, how can this help me prevent wasting material? How can I repurpose material potentially after the fact and not have to scrap it? Save time by bringing access and information to the appropriate people who need it. If you're an inspector out there in the field, having that data pop up to you as opposed to having to sift through an MTR, you can imagine there's time savings and value that comes from that. But I think you hit on a great point that, and a little bit tougher to quantify the value of it over long term, but there's such substantial value, be it from just an operational standpoint, having access to information and data as opposed to digging through file boxes and documents to try to create your maintenance plan, your integrity management program, integrating that with actually trustworthy data. You can imagine that there's just so much potential with that. And then you hit on that great point of, how much of the value of an asset is attributed to the data and records that you have about it, and your ability to produce those and pass them to whoever's purchasing your assets or purchasing your infrastructure. Being able to share that's just going to help you maximize the value of what you have. So really, really powerful in terms of what that can do. Another topic, obviously, that's getting a lot of traction, has been for a couple of years now, and I think is certainly on top of mind for a lot of owner operators, is ESG and sustainability. So one of the things that we wanted to discuss is how can shifting from documents to data, leveraging data more, how can it support the newfound focus on that and the drivers of ESG? I'll let you take that one first, Geoffrey.
Well, I'll just use an interesting example. Today, in the way most oil and gas concerns and their suppliers think about ESG is as a compliance task. I have to comply with the regulations, and I view that as a cost of doing business. Well, another way to think about it actually is that better quality data allows you to not only meet the compliance requirement in near real time, which also expands your ability to produce. This is a phenomenon I'm watching unfold a lot more in the United States, particularly where there are airshed limitations on emissions. States like Colorado and the Dakotas put caps, very strict caps on CO2 emissions, methane emissions from sites. Now, how do you measure that and produce that data so that the regulator can see that you are under your cap? Well, today we might be doing it in a document where we've measured or using engineering first principles. We've said this facility should be producing this much CO2. We submit a document to the regulator and we comply, and that gives us permission to produce for the next quarter. What if you could produce that data on a real-time basis to show that you are constantly in compliance? What the regulators are clearly saying in the United States is that if you can prove you're compliant in near real time, we will allow you to produce your assets and run your assets harder. And because we don't need to look after the fact you are under your cap. We can see that you're under your cap in real time. So it allows you to run, if you like, it's like sailing. You can sail closer to the wind and move a little bit faster. That's a very clear benefit from shifting away from this document version view of the world to one which allows you to satisfy that regulatory need, meet your compliance requirements, and improve the ability of your business to operate in a more sustainable fashion.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a big, such a big opportunity. I think, frankly, I believe for companies to leverage it for things like that. I mean, the ESG. I think there's certainly a challenge in today's world in quantifying or calculating the score, shall we say? Because in a lot of cases, similar to how risk management has been done for years, is if there just isn't the data or the information available, you're getting a 0 out of 5 or whatever
Precisely.
it may be.
Yeah.
And thus, I think, enabling companies to have that data and satisfy those KPIs or metrics or whatever they may be from an ESG standpoint, and actually having the ability to report it live. I mean, it's a huge risk mitigation and the ability to showcase that. And as you touched on, you'll probably be able to operate your infrastructure at a higher operating pressure or whatever you may need from your business standpoint. So yep. Quite powerful what you can do with that.
Yeah. And one thing I would add, I was with Repsol at their Tech Lab facilities earlier this year, all of course before the pandemic put kibosh to travel. And I'm on stage with their managers of environmental sustainability and governance, talking about their ability to comply with the EU Green Deal. So the EU has said we will be, as a continent, by 2050, carbon neutral. And Repsol, BP, Shell have all said we're going to be carbon neutral to comply with the EU Green Deal. Big oil companies have no idea how they're going to get there. But one thing they do know is that they're not going to get there by doing what they're doing today. And so a great deal of what they're doing is going to have to change. Now, why do we care here in North America? Well, frankly, if we sell anything into those continents, and many of us do, if we sell to those continents, we're going to have to comply with the Green Deal too. The EU is not going to simply let the Shells and the BPs of the world shift their carbon responsibility to some other continent, because the CO2 doesn't care where, it doesn't care about the border. This is going to become a North American challenge, which is how do you continue to supply into these markets that are having these quite high standards of execution and performance. And the only way you're going to do it is through data that proves that you are yourself achieving your carbon targets. The pathway to me, it's like it's all laid out in front of us. If we don't get on with this, we're progressively going to find ourselves shut out of key markets around the world.
Yep. So stepping into some other questions and moving on to this, and just in the interest of time, I might skip forward to our second question on this page here. I think it's worth always noting and assessing the current state of things. Obviously, Geoffrey, you touched on current state of kind of the macro markets and where things are at in terms of that. Let's focus this in on data and documentation and just the general kind of digital transformation, let's call it. Obviously there's varying levels of this across, and certain organizations are more focused on it than others. But what would you say overall is the current state of the industry as it relates to this document versus data? And then of course, maybe the kind of talk about the maturity level of where we're at so that we can assess that.
Well, in general, my observations would be that the industry is operating at a low level of data maturity relative to other industries that evidence a high level of data maturity. So we are low. The industry though is advancing very quickly because of the pressures that it's facing. The progress is uneven, so you'll find some companies are much more sophisticated than others. So this is an uneven and asynchronous situation that we're in. But the movement is clearly there to advance the state of data maturity. One of the critical features or reasons why is that many of the subsequent things that add great value in oil and gas, artificial intelligence and machine learning, adoption of automation and automation technologies, the use of modern trust technologies, all of these things are tied to high quality data. And the previous step to that is, well, you got to get mature on how you think about data. And that's why, so the industry is slowly working its way in that direction, but there's no question the progress is, you can see the progress being made.
Yeah, well, that's I just to build on your comment there, because I think it's, and it's very easy, as if you're embarking on the journey, let's call it, of digital transformation, we all want to get to that end game of the analytics and the smarts and the let's use buzzwords, AI and machine learning, et cetera. And I think what can sometimes be forgotten is just, hey, you can't. It's pretty tough to throw a document into your analytics machine. Let's not forget about how we need to really build the foundation of this, build up that trustworthy quality information that then can be used, because then you've unlocked so much potential with that. Now you're dealing with a tremendous data lake, or however you want to perceive it, that you can pull from for your operations to layer with other data sets and start doing some of the more smart, proactive, predictive things that I think the industry so badly needs. But that focus as far as our maturity level goes, it's got to start with the data and how that base level of data is there, and then move ahead with it. So that kind of segues nicely into our final question that we have here, in that we know that the industry has gathered a substantial amount of data. I'm sure it's difficult to even wrap our heads around how much data, and in what format that may be, locked in documents, locked in PDFs, digital paper, you name it. But this concept of the legacy data, all your existing infrastructure, everything you've got, what is the value of the data there, and how can we use it?
Well, this is probably one of the pivotal questions that our industry struggles with. And what is the value of this information? Well, it suffers from many problems, of course. One is it's the format that it's in makes it very hard to work with, so paper documents and the like. So put that to the side. Assuming you digitize it, now what? So, but in many cases, that data often lacks context. You don't know where it came from, and you don't know who produced it and under what circumstances and how reliable is it. So the industry tends to look at that information as suspect. And we see this because in ways, curious ways, where the industry will often repeat the same studies over and over and over again because it can no longer trust or feel that it can trust the study that it did just 2 years ago to try and address the same question. And so there's this great challenge with the industry is how do you get to that level of trust? Now, does that mean the data has no value? Absolutely not. There's still plenty of value there. A company I spent some time with out of California has taken 6 years of pump cycle data off of beam pumps, and has produced an AI engine that can, with uncanny accuracy, tell you when your pump is about to fail and precisely why. which bearing is going to go. I mean, it's uncanny. So but it's taken years to process the data and create the value. So is the value there? Absolutely. Do we know where it is precisely? No. Is the industry ready to embrace and tackle this? Yes, if the right tools are brought to bear to do things like help add context to that data.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I was gonna just say exactly what you were saying. I mean, bringing the right tools to do it. I mean, it's always seemed like such a Herculean task. I mean,
Yeah.
Are we gonna have to scan documents for months on end and try to figure this information out? You know, as technology is evolving and as we're pushing towards optical character recognition, different ways to scrape data out of documents and turn it into actually usable data, which then can be analyzed. And you know, I often look at the play, you know, as and this is a bit of an interesting one because it's tough for owner operators maybe to get around it, but it's a bit of a gap analysis. And I think the sooner we can realize, you know, tying back to those things like ESG, when, you know, you might have been getting a 0 out of 5 on this. Maybe now we can at least get you to a 4 or a 3 or something along the way when we leverage some semblance of data and do it. There may be gaps that you can identify, but I think you can identify those as areas where you may need to, it may help with your integrity management program, all your different planning that you're doing. So I think naturally, yeah, there's such a big amount of value in that information, and leaving it dormant in file boxes or documents. It's not going to help, you know, as we adapt the industry to handle the situation that we're in, right? And you won't find those efficiencies. You won't be able to you know, have more proactive and preventative maintenance and planning. So I think there should be a huge push around that in the coming years for sure to move it ahead. So yeah, I'd like to thank Geoffrey Cann for joining us. Always great to have your insight and expertise on the topic. We very much value that. So thank you very much, Geoffrey.
Yeah, much appreciated. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a much larger story here. If anyone's interested in it, by all means, track me down and we can talk about how to get that in front of your board or your management team.
Right on. And just in closing, all of this will be available on our LinkedIn page. So please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn if you don't already, Vintri Technologies. We also will have a YouTube channel, I believe, that can be shared there. So yeah, very much appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for joining. Apologies again for the technical glitches, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you.